Question 2 says, explain how blood glucose is regulated by glycolysis, glycogenesis, and gluconeogenesis activity. So for glycolysis and glycogenolysis, this is when we are breaking down glucose and glycogen to help us increase our low blood glucose levels. And this could be when we're exercising, our blood glucose levels drop from homeostasis, so that tells glycolysis and glycogenolysis to go. We need to start breaking down our glucose and glycogen that we have stored in order to produce ATP and the energy that we need to supply our muscle contraction so that they can keep going while we are exercising. So glycolysis and glycogenolysis help us raise low blood glucose levels, whereas glycogenesis is where we have a lot of excess glucose in our blood, so we want to store that as glycogen to help not only lower our high blood glucose levels back to homeostasis, but to also store that glucose as glycogen in order for us to use that energy and break that back down later when we need it. So glycogenesis helps us lower high blood glucose levels, and gluconeogenesis, it helps us when we have low blood glucose levels and we've already used up all our fuel of glucose and stored glycogen through glycolysis and glycogenolysis. So GNG is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrates. And so this happens when we have low blood glucose levels and we need to produce more glucose in order to maintain some of the tissue systems and stuff in our body that needs glucose in order to keep going. So that is when we have low blood glucose levels and we need to produce more glucose that isn't from carbohydrate bases. And so explain how 4 different variables regulate this balance. The first is when we have a big meal or we just took in a lot of food. This will lead to us having an increased blood glucose level. And so what happens is glycolysis and glycogenolysis are going to happen a little bit. They always are happening a little bit. We always have a little bit of glycolysis converting to pyruvate, that pyruvate going to Krebs, just to fuel our body with enough energy so that we can keep functioning. Even when I'm sitting right now, I'm going through a little bit, but not going through a ton like when we were exercising. For food intake with an increased blood glucose, glycogenesis is going to be happening a lot. This is because glycogenesis is where we want to store our fuel. So when we have a high blood glucose, we want to return to homeostasis. So we're going to take that excess glucose from the blood and convert it to glycogen to store it for later. And then gluconeogenesis is not going to be happening. This is because when we have a high blood glucose, gluconeogenesis is going to be inhibited or not happening because we don't want to form more glucose when we already have a lot in our blood. The second variable that regulates this balance is when we have a low food intake or we've been fasted for a little bit. This is when we have a low blood glucose level, and so glycolysis and glycogenolysis are going to be occurring a lot, and it's a very quick response because our body recognizes we have low blood glucose, so we need to start breaking down our stored fuels in order to dump that into the bloodstream to help raise those levels. For glycogenesis, it's not going to be happening very much when we have a low blood glucose. We will also decrease or inhibit our amount of glycogenesis occurring because we want to be breaking down our fuels to help raise those blood glucose levels instead of storing them, lowering our blood glucose levels further. And gluconeogenesis is going to be happening a good amount after hours and days. So if we are with low food intake for a longer duration of time, then gluconeogenesis will kick in because eventually we will run out of our fuels of stored glucose and glycogen to help supply our body with how much we need. And so eventually GNG will start happening. The third variable is insulin. When we have an increase of insulin, that means we have an increase of blood glucose. So glycolysis, glycogenolysis are not going to be happening a lot, but they're still going to be happening a little bit. Again, don't want to break down our fuels. We want to begin to store them. Glycogenesis is going to be happening a lot. We want to lower those blood glucose levels and store the excess glucose as glycogen. And gluconeogenesis is not going to be happening. Again, don't want to create more glucose when we already have a ton in our blood. Increased blood glucose is a decrease in GNG. The last variable is the hormones of epinephrine, norepinephrine, and glucagon. And these are released when we have a low blood glucose level or we're exercising, for example. And so glycolysis and glycogenolysis are going to be happening quickly. Very fast response. They're going to start kicking in right away to start breaking down our stored fuels to help us increase our blood glucose level and supply our muscles with energy from muscle contraction Glycogenesis not happening, don't want to store our fuels, want to break them down. And gluconeogenesis is slow if needed, have to burn through all our fuels.